Whose first time is at one of our Brooklyn Psychedelic Society events? Wow, okay. Well, we have a small but growing community called the Brooklyn Psychedelic Society, and I hope you guys enjoy this experience and can come to some of our other events. But thank you very much for coming. Who's been to the Brooklyn Psychedelic Society before? Where are my peeps at? What's up, guys? Make it, woo! Yeah! Woo! Talk to the new people. So thank you for coming. I'd like to introduce our speakers tonight. We're joined by Hamilton Morris of Vice's Pharmacopoeia. Raquel Bennett, is it Bennett or Bennett? Bennett. Raquel Bennett she's a clinical psychologist and founder of the CREA Institute. And psychopharmacologist and Professor Jason Wallach. So we're here to talk about legal marijuana. I'm really glad you guys could come. So yeah, we're here to talk about ketamine and other dissociatives. Quick, quick, useful lexicon announcement. It's actually dissociative, not disassociative. So some of your more pedantic-sided friends might have been kind of looking at you funny after you told them about the ketamine disassociative event. Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, so I'm gonna get started with some personal kind of things. Can I ask how you guys all came? It kind of came like a group package when this event came up, and could I ask how you guys might have met?
I Google stalked Jason.
Oh.
Am I on?
Yeah.
Why don't we start historically? Why don't you guys go first? Because probably it's farther back.
I met Jason in 2009 at a Horizons conference, and at the time I had been in Haiti collecting this supposed zombie poison, and I was looking for someone that had access to analytical instruments so I could see if it contained this chemical TPX, and Jason was a PhD student at that time, and he generously offered to analyze the zombie poison, and then we've been friends ever since and worked together and even co-authored a few publications on the subject of dissociatives.
Yeah, Hamilton comes down to the lab all the time, and I really commend, he's a journalist obviously, but a scientist as well. I think that's rare. He should be commended, but he works in the lab with me all the time, getting his hands wet, making chemicals and doing cool stuff, so.
Do you have a good zombie poison hookup still?
It's not a good zombie hookup.
Yeah, I think we still have some in the freezer at the lab. So if you want some inactive zombie poison, I might be able to hook that up.
So let's see, and so I met these guys in 2016. I was organizing the second CREA conference at that time, which is an event that's devoted to the use of ketamine in psychiatry and psychotherapy. And about 2 weeks before my event, we're now going into the 5th year, but at that time it was the 2nd year. And about 2 weeks before that event, I had found a medical pharmacologist who was going to come to my conference at that time to answer questions for me about the pharmacology and the pharmacokinetics of ketamine, which was over my head. I was getting a lot of questions that I couldn't answer. And anyway, I had someone lined up. He had to drop out due to a family emergency, and I was freaking out. And I was in my dining room banging away at my computer, cursing, as I tend to do. And I had a friend over who was patiently waiting for me to finish work, and who was watching television. He was channel surfing, and I was sort of ignoring him. And all of a sudden, some skinny white dude shows up on the TV screen. He was yakking on about PCP and psychedelic fish. And my friend says, Raquel, have you seen this? So I looked, and we looked at each other and we were like, oh my God, is that legal? Anyway, the next thing you know, some other little skinny white dude, sorry friends, gets on the screen and is explaining in great detail the chemistry and pharmacology of PCP. And I thought to myself, God, I need someone like that to explain to my group of clinicians how ketamine works. I need that guy. And so I Google stalked him. I found Jason, who was a guest on Hamilton's show, first season PCP. I found out who he was, and I started writing to him. And I started calling the secretary for the department of the school, and then later the dean. They thought I was nuts, but finally somebody took pity on me and gave me Jason's cell phone number. Correct me if I'm wrong. So finally I called him, we're like a week before my conference, and I said, I'm sending you a plane ticket. I need you to come to California. And he thought he was like in a Keanu Reeves movie, like get on the plane. But eventually I prevailed and he came, and we've been friends ever since. Jason actually is the star of the show at Kriya Conference. He's able to answer questions that nobody else has any idea what the heck is going on.
When did the Keanu vibe end? Was there like a abrupt, was it gradual or abrupt?
Where did it end?
We're gonna keep.
You have to get on the plane. You have no choice. I need you to get on the plane.
He's right there.
Very persistent, but I'm very glad I went. I was a little bit unsure at first, like, I don't know, it's like a week out, but yeah, very good decision.
So if it's not too personal, can I ask how you guys had what was your first interaction with ketamine or dissociatives, if you'd like to share? Okay, or we can... I have like 2 other questions here.
Let's see, my story starts in 2002. Anybody have a story that starts before 2002 that you want to share in this moment? Yeah, so the reason I got interested in this subject, it's personal for me. It's all totally driven by desperation, is the truth. So I was struggling with really severe refractory depressive illness for about a decade in my 20s. I'm 48 now. And I had had some psychotherapy, which was modestly helpful, somewhat helpful. I had tried a whole bunch of conventional oral medication, which had horrible side effects and wasn't helpful enough. And next thing you know, a friend of mine who was a psychiatrist took me to see an underground psychedelic shaman who gave me a variety of medicines which were either not helpful or which made things significantly worse. So that was pretty upsetting. And then at the end of that, with the help of a psychiatrist, I was able to have an injection of ketamine. This is 2002. And I was at my wit's end when this happened. I was truly on the verge of killing myself, and she knew that. And I got this injection of ketamine, and it saved my life. God came, or my vision was that God came and put a key in my ear and unlocked my brain, and suddenly I was able to feel myself and think clearly for the first time in years. And I thought to myself, holy guacamole, what is this? And I thought to myself, I was up in the cave space, and I thought to myself, how is it doing that? And is it replicable? Could it do this again for me? Or is this just like a total fluke? And I wanted to know, does it do that to other people? I was very excited. Of course, I couldn't tell my team about this because I was totally freaking paralyzed for an hour, so I had to keep that thought to myself. But anyway, that began my obsession with trying to understand how to use this tool therapeutically. 17 years later. So bing, bam, boom, here we are. And I just want to say for the record that I totally did not expect for my career trajectory to be world famous for psychedelic drugs. But what are you going to do?
I mean, I didn't have a single transformational experience like that, and my interest in dissociatives was more pure curiosity than a desire for a therapeutic effect. I think ketamine is a drug that's profoundly difficult to describe verbally, and I had read quite a bit about it. I had read John Lilly's book, The Scientist, which I highly recommend for anyone who's interested in ketamine and hasn't already read it. And it gives you a sense of the power of ketamine, both for good and for bad, in terms of inducing a sort of delusional state. and I'd read Arrowhead reports and things like that, but they all really failed to capture the essence of ketamine, which is a very bizarre thing that sort of transcends. It's ineffable and it's a little bit difficult to verbalize, but I was amazed by what it did, and then that became the entry point to many other dissociative anesthetics, which are either used medicinally or are sold on the gray market, and it's a pretty fertile area for research right now because it just keeps growing every year.
Yeah, I would add that I'm primarily interested in its therapeutic effects, specifically the use of ketamine to treat refractory mood disorders, including depressive disorders, bipolar disorder, and suicidal ideation. So I'm really coming at this from the clinical side, and also it's no secret that I myself have been a ketamine patient for 17 years, and I use that in addition to a variety of other strategies to stay well.
Is ketamine safe with bipolar? Because that's usually seen as like with traditional psychedelics like acid or mushrooms, it's usually seen as something to not mix, right? Or
well, right, so the problem is that the other things that you just mentioned, psilocybin, MDMA, LSD, they're serotonergic. They have a lot of activity in the serotonin pathway. That can be terribly destabilizing for someone on the bipolar spectrum, and really not a good idea. But in contrast, ketamine is primarily active in the glutamate pathway. We'll let Jason say more about that in a moment. But in any case, to answer your question, we only give ketamine treatment to people who have been diagnosed as bipolar if they're stable on a mood stabilizing or antipsychotic medication already to hold down the top end of their illness. And then if they continue to struggle with depression, as they often do, then we're using ketamine to lift up the bottom end. And the idea is that we're using the medicines together, ketamine on the bottom, antipsychotic on the top, to try to help people be contained in a more normal mood range.
Well, I guess, I mean, I'll say, you know, I'll give the story, I guess, of how I got interested in dissociative drugs and spent, you know, the last over 10 years studying them. It starts when I was really young. I was always very fascinated by psychoactive drugs. I can't really describe it. Even in like 3rd and 4th grade, I would go to the library and take out those propaganda kind of scare story books and just like ferociously, you know, read them. And I actually have a very distinct memory on the school bus reading the one about PCP and people thinking they could fly and all these ridiculous horror stories. But it didn't scare me, it just fascinated me a lot. And so, you know, there was some anthropological field work that I won't get too into. Eventually, I got to college, and because of my interest in psychoactive drugs, wanted to study, you know, how do these things do what they do? They have such profound effects, both at a personal level, just from a phenomenological level it's interesting, and also the therapeutic potential is also very important. And so I'm interested in all those things. And so, you know, I did my undergraduate in cell and molecular biology and focused on, I was interested in cannabinoids and classical hallucinogens more than. When I went to University of the Sciences to do my PhD work, there were several labs doing work with psychoactive drugs. But one lab run by Dr. Adeboye Adejari was doing work with PCP as neuroprotective agents. A lot of people had given up on PCP and other NMDA receptor antagonists in that field, but he felt that there was still potential for this class. And because of the work he was doing, you know, in medicinal chemistry and pharmacology, that was my interest as well in my background from my undergraduate research. And I never would have thought, hey, PCP is what I want to study, but I was like, well, this is interesting. I find it fascinating. The techniques he's using are things that I want to improve and learn, and so I might as well do it. And I really fell in love. It's a very fascinating class of drug. He also was an incredible advisor and gave me, you know, countless freedom to explore that area and explore my own interests. And so, you know, sort of developed into that, and I became more and more interested in understanding how these drugs work and finding sort of the ways in which they can be used clinically, and also understanding how they cause things like hallucinations and dissociative effects. One, because we can use that information to design better drugs for the clinic, by improving their tolerability. But if we understand how they're causing hallucinations, we might learn something about how the brain's machinery also generates sensory perception, visual experience. And that's something that really interests me, the relationship between the brain's hardware and the mind, right? So that's, I guess, where my interest came from with dissociatives.
So would someone mind explaining in a nutshell, maybe generally, how dissociatives are therapeutic, or maybe why we think them to experience them that way? Oh, maybe you can get some tea first if you want.
Why?
I mean, I can give you a historical,
Sure.
just a little preamble, and Jason, I'm sure, can talk about the pharmacodynamics. But so, you know, it's important to even talk about the discovery of dissociatives because they represented an entirely new pharmacological class. There are some naturally occurring substances that have dissociative-like effects. Ethanol is an example. Ibogaine is another example. Xenon, which is a naturally occurring element. It's a noble gas. It's in the air that we breathe in minute concentrations. All have dissociative-like effects, but there's nothing quite like ketamine or PCP that has yet been discovered in nature. So the original idea was actually, they were discovered accidentally. It was a serendipitous discovery, but for a long time people have been looking for anesthetics that would produce an effect like an opioid, that is something that would cause a loss of consciousness so that surgical procedures could be performed, but ideally wouldn't have some of the side effects that opioids have, specifically respiratory depression, which can be fatal. And a chemist named Vic Maddox, who was working for Park Davis, discovered PCP serendipitously and found that it had the same sort of anesthetic effect, but that it didn't suppress respiration in any way. So this was a very exciting discovery. And it was moved into clinical use pretty rapidly, first in animals, as this is typically done, and then it was approved for humans. But there was a sort of emergence phenomenon where people, after the surgical procedure was complete, would create some kind of ruckus in the hospital that was difficult for the healthcare providers. And I guess that's the way it went. So the idea was, how can we improve on these drugs? It clearly had very desirable therapeutic properties. And so there was a sort of initiative to find new derivatives. Vic Maddox, this original chemist, made quite a few himself. And then another chemist who was working at Wayne State University named Calvin Stevens, who was not, as far as I can tell, the history here is a little bit spotty. He was not a medicinal chemist as far as I can tell. He was actually just doing a sort of mechanistic study of this specific rearrangement, this thermal rearrangement. And he found a ketamine-like drug, and then later discovered that it had PCP-type anesthetic properties, and it was also tested and approved for human use and came to replace PCP specifically because it had a shorter duration and other improved therapeutic properties, so that this, even though it did cause an emergence phenomenon similar to PCP, it wasn't as prolonged, which made it better. And the term dissociative anesthetic, the first person to administer ketamine to a human being was this physician named Edward Domino, who's sort of one of the titans of aryl cyclohexylamine dissociative research. He's not the pizza guy, no. He's a great guy. He's still alive, actually.
What's the word again? You said you guys, originally we were going to title the event Ketamine and Other Archelycotoxins.
Aryl cyclohexylamines. Aryl is like
Hexylamine.
it's like an aromatic ring connected to a cyclohexane ring, which is a saturated 6-membered carbon ring, and then an amine, which is like a nitrogen. Okay, so if that meant anything to anyone. So Domino got approval to test ketamine in a prison population, which is actually still done to this day, but is a bit more controversial. It used to be routine to test new psychoactive drugs on prisoners. And
so legal, you said?
Yeah. Actually, it doesn't seem to be done in the United States as frequently. I just saw a recent study that was use of a cannabinoid called nabilone in treatment of PTSD-associated nightmares in prisoners in Canada. So there's still doing it to some extent. Probably they're doing it quite a bit, if I had to guess, but I don't know. Don't quote me on that. So anyway, Domino gives ketamine to a prisoner and is describing the effects that he observed to his wife, who's named Tony Domino. Interesting fact, John Lilly's wife was also named Tony. So there's two wives of ketamine pioneers with named Tony. Okay. Just had to throw that out there.
Everyone here know John Lilly? People familiar with that?
Okay. Good. That's good. Well, we can talk. I mean, you can talk all day about John Lilly, but okay. So then Domino tells Tony Domino that this drug produces a strange dissociation, and at the time they were calling them like cataleptoid anesthetics. And she's like, it sounds like a dissociative anesthetic. So she coined the term. That's where it all comes from, Tony Domino. And from there on, it became increasingly popular because it didn't have any of the problems, or didn't have a lot of the problems associated with the opioids. It was used as a battlefield anesthetic in Vietnam. It continued to increase in popularity. There was a World Health Organization report that said that it may be the most widely used anesthetic, period, in the world. So it's an immensely important anesthetic, and that's just like a taste of the history. But I can't even remember what the question was.
I think I started making a joke about pizza or something.
That was before the pizza
Okay,
joke.
I think Arca-Lyca, whatever means, or
Before that as well.
dissociative, something. I'm feeling a bit dissociated after that. So,
You were asking about the history.
yeah, I was curious how
How it works.
dissociatives even began to become seen as like a therapeutic sort of thing, and we just, that was the question. So yeah, Jason, did you have anything you wanted to add?
And I think that's the basis of it, and as any drug becomes widely used, people start finding new uses for it, off-label uses. There was also a lot of research into understanding how these drugs acted. At the time they were discovered, no one had any idea how they did what they were doing. And later work by David Lodge found that they're NMDA receptor antagonists, which there was work already with drugs of that nature that had shown anticonvulsant properties, neuroprotective properties, and all sorts of things. So you see this essentially branching out of interest with this class of drugs in all different therapeutic areas, as analgesics, new painkillers. Ketamine's been used off-label as an analgesic for decades as well. And so, numerous things. I mean, even there's been interest in their use in diabetes, as well as tinnitus, ocular pressure changes, all sorts of therapeutic indications have been pursued. As far as the most successful, obviously ketamine as a general anesthetic recently for treatment-resistant depression, which I'm sure we'll get into. Dextromethorphan is another NMDA receptor antagonist used as a cough suppressant, but is also approved as a combination drug called Nuedexta, which is used for pseudobulbar affect, which is sort of an emotional liable disorder. Another example is memantine or Namenda, which is used in Alzheimer's disease as a neuroprotective drug. So I think you see this like wide branching out into all different therapeutic areas, and I foresee that continuing. A big issue with the drugs, though, has been for everyone that has managed to get approved, 5 to 10 have failed the clinical trials, not necessarily because of efficacy, meaning they had the therapeutic effect, but because of side effects and tolerability, particularly the dissociative effects. In certain indications, those are considered not desirable.
That just happened with Repastamil recently. They discontinued.
Oh, and they have several follow-ups that I know. So
Let me add a little bit to this story. As I understand it, people's appreciation of ketamine, and then now coming into the S-ketamine approval that happened this week, which, by the way, we're not feeling very appreciative about because of the cost. But anyway, let me back up. There were always sort of two strands, as I understand it, in the history of therapeutic ketamine. Part of it came from the underground, from the psychedelic guides. And in particular, the person who stands out in history is a Mexican psychiatrist whose name was Salvador Roquet. Anybody ever hear of Roquet? Yeah, right on. And so, although ketamine was always technically legal, because it's Schedule III, at least in this country, it has been lumped together with other psychedelic agents and considered part of illicit underground activity because it's used in a way that's outside of what medical providers normally think of. Anyway, Roquet was using ketamine in Mexico in combination with psilocybin and LSD for psycholytic reasons back in the, I think, 1980s, I want to say, to break apart people's psychological defenses and character structure to help them have rapid personal growth. So again, the use of ketamine was technically probably legal because he was a physician, but lumped together with other illicit activities. And he used to had two stereos going, playing different sets of music at the same time to create a cacophonous and chaotic sound environment, among other things, while administering these medicines. Anyway, so his students, who were psychotherapists, went on to appreciate ketamine for its psychedelic and psycholytic and therapeutic properties. So that's one strand of it. At the same time, there's another piece about ketamine that comes clearly out of anesthesiology and out of orthopedics and pain management. So it's well known that ketamine is a good anesthetic agent for a variety of reasons. And some smart young orthopedist noticed this was around 2000, I can't think of the guy's name, but he noticed that when he was using, that he had patients who were having orthopedic surgeries in the hospital in America, and that some of them got ketamine as part of their anesthetic regimen. And he noticed that some of his patients were very depressed after orthopedic surgery and that they did very poorly. They had difficulty engaging in physical therapy and difficulty getting better. And other patients did really well, and they were optimistic and more psychologically robust. And he noticed that there was a correlation between the patients who got ketamine as part of their surgical anesthetic regimen and patients who got other stuff. And he saw that there might be a mood improvement associated with getting ketamine in surgery. And so he published an important paper. I'm so sorry, I can't think of the guy's name right this second. And that opened the door for the study of the relationship between ketamine and mood modulation.
What year was this you were saying?
It was around 2000. So this is why I need my computer. I told the guys I wanted to bring my computer in case this came up, and they discouraged me. See, this is the reason. But somebody can look it up. But in any case, what I want to say is that what we see now in therapeutic ketamine is really the convergence, and in fact the collision of three different fields, namely ketamine and anesthesiology. Anesthesiologists have the best understanding of ketamine, get the most formal training, I guess, and ER docs too, actually. In the safety parameters of using this surgical anesthetic, because part of the body of knowledge comes from those guys. And then when we use it for the treatment of depression, it's really the psychiatrists and the psychologists who really have the most skills in doing the diagnosing and the treatment planning for people, for that population. And also we owe a debt of gratitude to the underground psychedelic guides, who often don't get acknowledged, but who really kept alive the burning ember of knowledge about psychedelic experience. So what I'm trying to do with Kriya Conference is to create a space where people from different backgrounds can cross-pollinate and share information so that we can all help each other and learn from each other and bring together really these three fields, each of which contributes to our understanding of how to use this tool.
And one thing that I think is worth mentioning is typically there's this division made between medical and non-medical use, and the two are treated as if they're completely separate worlds, but they actually tend to follow each other pretty closely. So in 1970, you have FDA approval of ketamine. By 1971, there's already a letter published in the New England Journal of Medicine that shows that there's non-medical use of ketamine. And of course, this is immediately dismissed as problematic. It's abuse. It should be discouraged. But you have to ask, why do people use things non-medically? Why is somebody driven to use a substance outside of a medical context? Well, maybe it's because they're chasing after some sort of therapeutic effect that isn't at all different from what a physician might be looking for as well. So even though it's typically said that, the antidepressant effect of ketamine is discovered clinically, I think you could make an argument that there was a long prehistory of people self-medicating with this substance who recognized that it had some form of an antidepressant effect. I mean, you can find this all over self-reports that predate the clinical understanding of this. And even with the approval of Spravato 5 days ago, I mean, I think what's so funny about this is it's pretty similar to a dosing pattern that you would see for a non-medical user. These are bumps, nasal bumps of ketamine that are taken.
The latest and greatest rave toy, right?
I mean, and they're taking great pains to differentiate this from the non-medical ketamine. I've even seen in the CNN description of the approval of Spravato, they called it a ketamine-like drug, or a cousin of ketamine. Well, it is most certainly ketamine. It's a single enantiomer of ketamine that hasn't previously been approved in the United States, although it's used in the Netherlands and Germany and a number of other countries.
Is everyone familiar with the recent, I'm assuming most of the recent FDA approval of S-ketamine nasal spray? Do you want to just give a little...
Yeah, just the quick overview is that Janssen Pharmaceuticals approved this product called Spravato. It's a nasal spray bottle that contains 2 14 milligram squirts per bottle. And you, in order to get a prescription for it, you have to be taking an oral antidepressant, but you have to be under the supervision of a doctor. You have to do it in an office. You're given 1 14 milligram squirt followed by another 14 milligram squirt, and you're allowed up to 6 of these squirts after in a single
It's a puff also, right?
A puff. I haven't seen.
Spray, one spray.
Spray.
I just use a squirt.
I thought it was a 28 milligram squirt, but you think it's
The bottle is 28. It's 2 14 milligram spritzes. It's a spritz. I haven't seen it. I'd have to see what the mist looks like. A better description of it.
Have anyone seen if it's more squirty or spritzy, or
an aerosol maybe?
Actually, they're not actually out yet. They haven't been distributed yet, so nobody has.
So it's a mystery for now. We'll know in the future. But yeah, so at the beginning you're given, and you have to use one bottle. Only contains 2 of these 14 milligram squirts or sprays, whatever. And then after this induction phase, then you are transitioned into a maintenance phase after a few weeks of treatment, and then you can have up to 3 of these spray bottles. It's a pretty weird way of doing it, and this is also part of what they call a REMS program. Are people familiar with this idea? There's certain high risk, or at least expected to be high risk pharmaceutical products, and like an example would be Accutane, which can cause horrible birth defects. Another example would be a thalidomide derivative called lenalidomide. And so in order to get these drugs, you have to get them through a pharmaceutically sponsored REMS program that involves patient education. Sometimes you have to have the medication directly delivered to your door, and you're given informational DVDs to prevent you from hurting anyone else with the drug. And you could say that this is about education, and it's a good thing, but there's also a question about, how much of this is truly designed for patient benefit, especially if the treatment might cost over $81,000 a year.
I think that's immoral.
I think it's. What do I think it is? It's a form of medical criminal. It's a form of medical extortion, is what it is. It's terrible. The cost.
Well, yeah. I mean, to play devil's advocate, I think what it's going to come down to is how much the physicians are charging for the office visit, because just the price of the spray is not that different from what I see a lot of physicians charging for ketamine infusions for the same dose.
That's problematic too.
Well, there's
yes, but that's, I mean, so it's not like they're doing something that's like different from the current status quo. I mean, I agree the whole system has problems, but it's, if you want to criticize, I think then we have to criticize the whole entire infusion community, or at least ones who are charging $1,000 an infusion. I mean, that's crazy for $25 worth of white powder.
I want to just be clear. that a 100 milligram dose of ketamine, when acquired correctly and through an appropriate medical channel, is $1.59. Less than $2 for the actual medicine for generic racemic ketamine. And I'll let Jason explain what that exactly means. But what are they charging per dose? Anybody know?
I worked it out to about $31 a milligram.
Okay, and then how many milligrams? Do somebody?
It's a, yeah.
It's what?
600 to 800 a dose is what they're charging.
They're charging $800 a dose for this nasal S-ketamine.
And that might not include the doctor's visit,
Right, I
again,
understand
because
that.
their time, and, yeah, so that's where it's
The
going to go
DVDs.
up.
My point is that the professional's time is a constant, right? It's the same amount of time if you're providing generic racemic ketamine or if you're providing left-handed filtered patented ketamine. There's a tremendous difference in the cost of the medicine itself because of the patent. We need to talk about that. But I want to say for the record that I'm in favor of using injectable racemic generic ketamine when clinically needed, and that physicians should provide that and patients should ask for it.
But another thing is, insurance will now cover. Again, to play devil's advocate, insurance may not cover that, and so those patients are going to pay.
It won't cover it.
Whereas for S-ketamine, they will be covered, and therefore, yes, the insurance company's paying more, but the patient's not. The other thing is doctors are going to be much more comfortable using that FDA stamped of approved nasal spray. And so I think we're going to see much wider use and greater patient access to ketamine, which is the most important thing. I mean, I do agree fundamentally, these cost issues are a part of a much wider systemic issue in our society. But if insurance is going to cover it and more patients are getting access, I understand that. And Janssen put out, probably $1 billion to get this drug approved, to prove, to the FDA that it does work. And that is going to go, it's a huge social accomplishment. It's going to go a long way to convincing a lot of physicians who might have been on the fence about using it. And they showed that it's safe. They did a bunch of toxicity studies. And so, it's easy to point fingers at them and say it's all about the money and stuff, and it is. I mean, yes,
Yeah.
of course.
And that's
Of course. But that's how American capitalism works, and I don't know that, we can talk about better systems, that's a whole nother debate, but I will say from seeing where money comes from for research, you're not going to get money from investors unless they think they can profit off of it. It sucks. But if I have a good idea and I say, well, yeah, it'll be really cool because then we'll know how this receptor, mediates this pathway in the auditory system. They just don't care. It's like, oh, that's great, but I'm not giving you
What about
50 grand.
MDMA and MAPS? That was all done through a
No,
non-profit.
we're not going to go there.
But I don't.
Separate category.
Yeah, I mean.
Save that for after the show because it's a separate after the event.
Try to
It's a whole
raise money.
tangent.
Yeah.
But to Jason,
But
your
even that, now you're seeing with psilocybin there, it's not, well, we won't get
It's not
into
going
it,
well.
but yeah.
But it's to your point, Jason. I do really appreciate that Johnson & Johnson shouldered the burden of putting out all the money for all the trials that were necessary for FDA approval. So good on them for that. But I still think the price is outrageous and inaccessible.
Yeah.
And if they were charging a reasonable price for their patented filtered product, which I'd like for you to explain in a moment, then I would be advertising for them for free. I would be advocating. It really is an advance forward as we think about a new category of glutamate modulating medication for the treatment of refractory mood disorder. That's good. The problem is that the price is too freaking high. And there's a tremendous precedent in medicine of using injectable ketamine. Every ambulance in this country carries injectable ketamine on their rig. They give it out in every ER. We know that it's safe. We know that it's effective. There's really no good reason
It'd
to
be great
not.
if insurance would cover that. And
Okay, so it's a process, right? It's not an endpoint. It's
Insurance.
It's a process.
Yeah.
Process.
Hamilton, how did capitalism start? Just kidding, sort of. Well, I was actually going to ask, do you think with the prices of this, it seems like maybe there'd be, what I imagine as running the Brooklyn Psychedelic Society, I get a lot of people who are clearly distressed, who come to me like, I really need help. I'm like an undergrad. I've been depressed for so long. Like, what do I do? And when you have things like this that are like the studies show, it's efficacious for treatment-resistant depression. Like, people are going to be much more legitimately drawn to the underground use of ketamine. And I'm curious your guys' thoughts on, would you speculate that that might be a legitimate way to get similar benefits?
Well, certainly not a legitimate way.
But some people, not the majority, I would wager. You're saying?
I'm just saying, like, it's, when you have something that substantial, like $1 billion costs this much money to go to it, and it's like out there in public. If someone, let's say, both like from a legal standpoint, if someone gets caught with ketamine, like, why are we doing this? Like, I was trying to not be depressed. It's like, and they're doing that like genuinely. It just seems like very inhumane. Like, that's not news to you guys, but I'm saying, like, that's going to happen. Like, I meet people sometimes in the Psychedelic Society who are like moms and pops, like acidic Jews sometimes will come
But
in.
there's a couple of problems that need to be named with that approach.
Well, no, I'm not on an approach. I'm just talking. I'm just asking. Like, that's going to happen more and more. That's what I'm.
I think that's a positive thing.
Medicating these people? Is that what you're
So yeah, 'cause people are going to go to the
Yeah,
underground.
but here's the problem, Colin. I mean, there's a whole bunch of them.
Okay.
Let me name a couple of them. First of all really excellent psychological treatment begins with an excellent diagnosis, where the clinician takes a look and says, hey, here's how I understand the cause of your suffering, and then comes up with a treatment plan that matches the diagnosis. So ketamine works for some things, but not for others. And I give a whole sort of hour-and-a-half long lecture on that, which I can't get into right now. But part of it is doing a diagnosis-driven treatment. Ketamine doesn't work the same for all forms of depression. Some people are much better served by using MDMA or by not using medicine at all. Some people would be harmed by this, so that's part of it. Part of it is that just using ketamine doesn't build your skill set. But people need a little therapy to go along with their medication of any form, so that ultimately they can help themselves. My idea is to get myself fired because I did such a good job in helping people gain some skills and insight that they don't need me anymore. Not because I was practicing unethically, but rather, no, seriously. But people need skills in addition to medicine, so that's part of it. Using it on your own doesn't provide that. And finally, I've seen a couple of really terrifying medical emergencies. People who had loss of airway or people who had a seizure during the course of medically supervised, safe and legal ketamine administration. And thank God there was a physician in the suite who knew how to assess and manage those situations. I'm a psychologist. That's outside of my scope. I don't know how to do that by myself. And so I want to be really clear that using this medicine outside of a supervised context, I think that's not safe.
Okay. Don't do ketamine, guys.
Well, I was going to say on the bright, on the bright side of all of this, like, you know, again, back to this interplay of the gray and black market and the medically sanctioned world of science, there's an interplay. So black market ketamine is still available. It will probably always be available. And this is a way to increase our understanding of this substance. So maybe it won't be much more available. This is all going to have to be determined by what insurance covers.
Isn't black market ketamine, though, just medically made ketamine that's been...
Mm-mm. And it could be anything in that white powder.
That's true, but I'm
It's typically
saying...
diverted from pharmaceutical supplies, but there's some exceptions where, you know, a company might be producing a batch of ketamine during the day for a pharmaceutical house, and at night they'll make an extra batch. I highly doubt they go through quite the same degrees of stringency to make sure the impurities are at the right levels and all that.
But the biggest producer of illicit ketamine is probably illicit.
Probably.
Illicit labs.
Yes.
Yeah,
It's,
that's all.
it's a difficult synthesis to do clandestinely.
I know, yeah. Jokes, pizza jokes, ketamine jokes. So many. But sorry, what were you saying, Hamilton? You were describing how the transition to is going to enhance like the illicit market.
Well, it will just enhance our understanding. I mean, it's not ideal. I think that everyone would agree that it's not ideal, and it remains to be seen exactly how many people will truly be given access to affordable ketamine through the approval of Spravato. But at the very but at the very least, publications will be generated. Our understanding of ketamine as an antidepressant will be increased, and it's a stepping stone, I hope, that may increase availability of ketamine as a treatment for depression in general, and it has been increasing dramatically over the last few years.
At some point, Colin, can I talk a little bit about different ways of using ketamine therapeutically?
Please.
Is this the right moment for that?
Yeah.
Okay. And I want to make sure that Jason, or anybody, explains exactly what esketamine
Yeah,
is. So we'll circle back to that. But there's a lot of confusion in the field about how ketamine is being used. So let me see if I can clear some of that up right now. So let me put out a couple of different ways of thinking about ketamine treatment. This is ketamine treatment for severe and refractory depression that hasn't responded adequately to other conventional interventions. So some docs are giving ketamine as a biological or biochemical or pharmaceutical agent, and they're giving it in a sub-psychedelic dose. So the dose of ketamine on purpose is designed on purpose to prevent you from having a psychedelic or mystical experience. That's the fundamental model. And Spravato, this esketamine product, and also most ketamine infusion that you see advertised on the internet.
Even for therapy, it's at the psychedelic.
Okay. So there's a therapeutic protocol in place called the NIMH protocol. So this was approved by the National Institute of Mental Health, I think, in 2017. And so the protocol is to give 0.5 milligrams per kilogram by body weight of the patient of ketamine in a 40-minute long saline drip. And the patient sits there and receives the ketamine, and it helps their depression. Unfortunately, the dose is, for many people, the dose is too low. And so the way they get it, but they don't want you to have psychedelic experience. They don't want to raise the dose when working this way. Because having psychedelic experiences, I guess when you're actively suicidal and you think that you're in the presence of God, I guess that's a bad thing. It's not totally clear to me how that works. But anyway, the idea is to prevent psychedelic experience. And so to get around this problem, what they do is they cluster treatment together. They give 6 treatments, usually in a 2-week, sometimes 3-week period. The idea is to get enough medicine cumulatively into your body to do the magic thing that ketamine does to relieve severe depression. This is a medical model where the patient doesn't participate at all in the treatment. All they do is they just show up to the appointment, and then the medicine or the doctor does all the rest of the work. And this isn't fundamentally a bad model. This is a very excellent model if you need surgery or certain other kinds of medical interventions where you want to just like lie there and you don't want to do anything. It's great, except for one thing, which is it's not clear to me that this is the best way to help people who are having a mental health problem, is to make them passive and powerless. I think that's a terrible idea. So in contrast to that, let me talk about a different way of using ketamine. Same medicine, different strategy. A different way of using this tool is to use ketamine as a lubricant for psychotherapy. Somebody mentioned MDMA over here, so much like the MDMA paradigm. So in this model of using ketamine, it's used with a psychotherapist. And the idea is to use the medicine to be a little bit relaxing and a little bit intoxicating to help the patient get to, verbally, material that is too painful or too shameful to get to otherwise. And when you ask clinicians who practice in this way, why the patient is getting better, why their depression is relieved, they'll tell you that the reason the patient is getting better is the metabolism of this stuck psychological material. Again, this is a sub-psychedelic dose. You don't want the patient too far out. You can't talk to them if the dose is too high. But I just want to be clear that in the first model, the infusion model, nobody's talking to the patient. And in the second model, the emphasis is on the talking. And I want you to understand that in a psychotherapy model, each person in the room, the therapist and the patient, are each being called on to contribute 50% of the effort to make it a success. And there's a third model in therapy, which is a psychedelic or shamanic model. So in this way of working with ketamine, it's mostly done by injection at like 1.0 to 2.0 milligrams per kilogram. In this model, the the visions are valued. That's the point. So in the first two things I said, that you're trying to avoid visions. That's considered a problematic side effect. In the third way of working, the visions are considered meaningful. They're considered a gift from God. And the role of the therapist is to ensure the patient's physical and psychological safety during the treatment. And then after that, as a therapist, you work with the patient to extract or construct meaning out of what they saw, out of what the patient saw, and to convert their visions into something actionable. Help the patient to convert their own visions into something actionable. Something to get the message from the medicine about what they can do differently, even a baby step in their own lives, to move themselves toward wellness. So there's three totally, fundamentally different, conflicting paradigms, different ideas about how to use this same tool, ketamine. So what do I want to say about this? The question that I get asked the most as a ketamine specialist, the question I get asked the most is, can I have some free drugs? The answer is no. But the question I get asked the second most as a ketamine specialist is, which of these strategies works the best? What's the best route of administration for this medicine? What's the best dosing strategy for this? And the answer is they all work. Different treatment for different people. For some folks, low-dose sub-psychedelic ketamine infusion is just the thing. It's gentle, it's pretty darn safe. We send people to the anesthesiologist all the time who need this approach. And some folks need ketamine-facilitated therapy. They actually need to talk during their ketamine treatment. They get a lot of benefit out of that. And some folks, actually 1/6, 1 out of 6 of my clinical population actually qualifies for psychedelic ketamine treatment. Triptopluto and back, the whole banana there. It's a much smaller number than you would think who actually benefit from this. It can be very scary if you do this and you're not adequately psychologically prepared. As I said, there's some danger involved. So again, the thing that I really want to convey to you is to be educated, to know what to ask for as a consumer. If you're a provider, to be working with a variety of ketamine services, to be skillful with a couple of different routes of administration, and to be knowledgeable about different dosing strategies, and to know what to use when. Not everybody gets the same treatment. This is not a one-size-fits-all kind of a deal.
Thank you. Yeah, anyone do some snaps for class? That was really Is it legally mandated then for what the patient is allowed to receive, one of those 3 dosage levels?
No.
Like when you say qualify, like 1/6 qualifies, there's some protocol to...
No, that's my clinical judgment and my experience, having done this for a really freaking long time. But basically, here's the thing. Is that we've demonstrated, we know that giving ketamine in a pretty high dose range over here is considered safe and effective in a medically supervised setting for medically fragile patients. And they do it all the time for anesthesia and analgesia, meaning for sedation and pain management for medical patients like in a hospital or an ER or something. So we accept that this is safe and this is standard practice, and they've been doing it for 50 years. And over here now we have Spravato and we have the NIMH protocol saying that a little tiny bit of ketamine, like a little bump of K, is considered safe and effective for people who are psychiatrically fragile, a fragile population, people who are suffering. So what I'm trying to do, I don't have enough, I need one more arm here, is it becomes problematic at some point to argue that the dose in the middle, the psychedelic dose range, is somehow like not safe for healthy people. Because you're already arguing that the low dose is safe for psychiatrically fragile people, and the high dose is safe, for medically fragile people. So what I want to do is take a look at what's happening in the middle here. Anyway, so none of this is really written down yet. It's all in development, something I've been working on for many years. And again, it is the skillfulness of the ketamine provider, someone who's been doing this a long time, and there's this small group of people in the community who have been doing this, who know how to tell the difference about what's likely to be helpful. And I just want to say one more thing, which is I love treatment success. And if I'm gonna ask the patient to throw down a couple $1,000 for treatment, I wanna be pretty confident that it's gonna work. And so that's, I'm trying to give people the best treatment I can, with all the tools that I've got, I try to give people what I think is likely to be helpful.
Jason, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Are there neurological differences between those three different experiences? Because as Hamilton was mentioning, these are kind of like emergent properties of these chemicals, right? Is there like a...
I'm in emergence from anesthesia.
okay, when you're coming out of... All right.
That's considered a bad thing in this context, Colin.
I might be mixing some things up right now. Emergence, I'm thinking like emergence is like consciousness is an emergent property of lower physical...
Yeah, I mean, you're saying are there different physiological things going on?
Yeah, like the three levels that Raquel described.
I mean,
is that...
I think, well, certainly in the sense that experientially they're different, so I'm sure there are different underlying physiological changes in the brain. To what extent it's the same changes just to a different magnitude versus the incorporation of new pathways is unclear. And the true reality is, I mean, I can talk about various hypotheses to explain the dissociative effects, the hallucinations, the antidepressant effects. The reality is we don't know at all. And that's insane to say, considering millions and millions and millions of dollars have been spent, but we really do not know. There are many different hypotheses that they all have advantages and a lot of disadvantages. And so, it's kind of absurd. The one thing we do know pretty well is that the NMDA receptor seems to be key in all of this. But so these drugs block the NMDA receptor, which is a major glutamate receptor in the brain. But when you block the NMDA receptor, it's not so simple as if you just activate an opioid receptor, if that's even simple, but it's very complicated. So
Don't get him going down this road.
essentially,
Hamilton,
by blocking that, you may have thousands of different chemical changes that occur within a single cell, right? And then these cells are connected into neural networks, and many, many, many different things change in these various neural networks. So, for example, you think, okay, these drugs block glutamate, so they're anti-glutamate drugs. Well, no. By blocking glutamate on certain inhibitory neurons, those neurons become inhibited themselves, and that disinhibits excitatory glutamate neurons. So these drugs actually increase glutamate release elsewhere in the brain. Okay? And then that activates the release of serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, endorphins, all sorts of neurotransmitters all over in different regions of the brain at different time points. And so it's like trying to find a needle in a haystack, right? And so the problem is people will find one of those pathways and say, oh, this is the new explanation of the antidepressant effects. It sounds sexy to pretend like you know what's going on. But the reality is there's 100 other things that also correlate with the antidepressant effects. They happen at the same time. You can make all sorts of, deductive arguments and reductionist perspectives about the relationship. So there's a lot of hypotheses, but we really don't know. So other than I think there's very good evidence that the NMDA receptor is involved in the dissociative effects and the hallucinations, and probably the antidepressant effects.
But I found that people are more accepting of saying, I don't know, when you have a PhD. But,
even scientists pretend that they know. Or maybe they think.
I think I know what's going on, actually. The most prominent theory I've seen, I'm serious. Hear me out, guys. Lizards. That zombie sauce, Hamilton, neurogenesis and neuroplasticity come up a lot, at Horizons.
Right, so this is an interesting point. Just today, Hamilton and I were talking about this. I was reading about this because it's, okay, you increase glutamate, that activates a neurotrophic factor called BDNF, and that causes synaptogenesis, neurogenesis. Great. There's a bunch of literature showing that a single dose of cocaine does that exact same thing. In this case, though, the scientists have interpreted to say that that's responsible for the addictive effects of cocaine. Now, maybe it's in different regions, although it doesn't really look like it, but you see what I'm saying? You can make a beautiful story with experiments. But that doesn't mean that that's the actual accurate explanation for what's going on. And so many times people in science create a very sexy story that gets in the headlines and gets them grant funding. And I mean, this is really systemic, but sometimes it goes really deep, and they'll create animal models that are basically self-fulfilling prophecies for their own hypotheses to justify the continued funding that's going on. And so, you know, we don't know. And it's okay. Like, we know a lot about what ketamine does. There's a ton of evidence that it does all of these things. It's taking that next step to extrapolate it and say, this is what's responsible for the clinical effects. That's where the limitation is, and I don't think we should be forced to do that. We should collect as much evidence as we can until we have the tools to really, you know, you can never prove anything either, but you can support a hypothesis very well and disprove a lot of other ones. And that's what we really should be trying to do, is disprove everything until we're left with the best possible explanation, and then try to disprove that.
Well, and I want to tag on to what Jason just said, which is, I don't care how it works. I don't understand how ketamine works to relieve depression. I don't know. I'm going to leave it to the neuroscientists to figure that out. But what I do care about is that I can observe that it works. I don't know how it works, but I know that it works. And I know that it works for about close to 70% of people with severe and refractory depression who are correctly diagnosed. And in the same way that I really don't understand what's happening under the hood of my car, I don't care. You know, if there's a problem, I'll take it to the mechanic or to the neuroscientist. But I do know if the car is working or not. And so I only care about what the patient reports and what, as the clinician, what I can see. So all this reductionistic stuff about explaining it with neurotransmitters and chemicals and all that, not something that I'm interested in doing.
And what the heck, Jason?
It's helpful to know, because then we can use that information to design better drugs. That would be the advantage of having that. But the reality is, ketamine's antidepressant effect, that was not an intended consequence. No one designed ketamine to be an antidepressant. No one designed it to be a painkiller. It was designed as an anesthetic. So, like, and that's the case with many, many, many drugs, is, you know, their use ends up being something that was very different from what they were developed for. And that's okay. You don't, for the clinical use, you do not need to understand the pharmacological effects in the sense of, like, mechanistically how the drug's doing what it does. You want to understand potential toxicity risk, metabolism, how the drug moves around the body, its half-life. Those are very easy things to measure and understand.
And one thing to keep in mind, to underscore what Jason is saying, is that people do assign a lot of value to these experiments. So if you have a Google Scholar alert on ketamine, pretty much every week you're going to see a new paper, and the number of explanations are just ridiculous. There's a couple papers that say that it exerts its antidepressant effect through some interaction with the gut microbiome. So it, increases the amount of some beneficial lactobacillus, and that's what is causing the antidepressant effect. Or that the one that did make the headlines somewhat recently was an experiment that was done in humans where they found that the antidepressant effect was blocked by an opioid antagonist, and then they concluded, thus, ketamine is an opioid, has opioid-like abuse potential, we must use it cautiously for this reason. But then another experiment came out very recently where they also found that some of the anti-nociceptive effects of ketamine are blocked by a CB1, that's cannabinoid receptor 1, which is in the brain inverse agonist. So you can draw the same conclusion, say that, it's exerting its effect through cannabinoid receptors, or interaction with mTOR, or through this specific metabolite hydroxynorketamine, which is produced by the R enantiomer, which isn't in this new approved formulation. So you can bounce around with this stuff endlessly, and you have to be careful in not assigning too much value to it, because it can totally derail a clinical understanding if you're not looking at the results.
I'll tell you how I think it works.
But actually, I kind of want to, as Raquel is kind of in between, like, Jason's a neuroscientist, Raquel's a clinical psychologist, you're kind of like Goldilocks, you interface with both the psychology and clinical side. Or neuroscientific, what's your take on what causes depression?
My take on
What causes Depression?
Yeah, or like I'm curious, Hamilton.
How much time do you have?
I'm just curious, what you might. I don't know.
There's a lot of things that cause depression, and I don't think that I can give a simple answer to that.
What were you going to say, Raquel?
I'm going to talk about ketamine more phenomenologically, which is to say this, that when you give a psychiatric patient who has been correctly selected and extensively prepared, when we make the decision to give them an injection of therapeutic ketamine for psychiatric reasons, what they report is the following kind of experience, which is very unreductionistic, but namely that the body goes to sleep and movement stops. Automatic body function continues, like swallowing and breathing and blinking, and the movement of food through your gut, which is called peristalsis. That goes all continue because they're all automatic. So the body goes to sleep very temporarily. People report this. And then the chattering mind and the thoughts and the cognitions and all the intellectual activity, that also goes to sleep temporarily. And what happens is, what people report is that the thing that, the essence of people's personality, the Raquelness or the Jasonness or the Hamiltonness or the Collinness, whatever that is, the essence of who you think you are is released. People describe it coming out of the top of their heads, right through the cranium, and then being free to explore the universe for a little bit of time because the body sensations are numbed or dulled. And people go on to have fantastic, colorful, dreamlike visions. Sometimes they end up in frightening places, but usually they don't, particularly when they're well prepared. And then they're out there for a bit, 20 minutes of like pretty intense mental activity. The whole round trip is about 75 minutes, give or take. And then people come on back, and then we talk about what happened. So that's what I think is happening, and I didn't mention a single receptor or neuron, not once.
One thing I'm also interested in, switching gears to behavioral economics quick, with the psychology, is it seems to me as an outside observer that like psychedelics are enabling effective therapy for treatments that would never have been able to happen before. Like someone I know who was a therapist who was using the aid of psychedelics said that the person they were treating said their therapist said it would take 18 years for you to work with this trauma. And what I'm wondering, mainly from Raquel, but if you guys want to chime in, is when this effective therapy, either through mid-level or shamanic level doses, starts actually healing people, do you think there's a conflict of interest right now when the patient starts getting better?
I want the patient to get better.
Right, wouldn't you say that's a difference in how therapy's been going on? Like, think about it as it is traditionally without psychedelics or something, and then maybe just kind of, you see people getting happier, and you might be thinking, fuck, this is like, I'm losing a source of income here. And like, that's gonna change. I'm wondering if you agree with that, if it's gonna change things.
It doesn't seem like you're gonna be losing any money with Spravato or anything. It seems very profitable.
That's the problem with Spravato, right? That's the problem, is that it's not necessarily, Spravato, the nasal spray thing, it's not required that it's embedded in the context of an ongoing therapy relationship. And so if the thing that the patient learns how to do in order to feel better is to come to the doctor to get a bump of hay, and they're not learning any new skills, that sounds to me like we might be potentially creating an army of addicts. Because the thing that clearly works the best, in my opinion, having done this for a really long time now, coming up on 2 decades, is some form of ketamine treatment, sometimes combined with antidepressant oral medication, always combined with psychotherapy for the treatment of depression, and a whole bunch of free stuff, like exercising. People can do that for free, and it really helps a whole lot. And using a sleep schedule, also free. And watching what you put into your body. Caffeine and alcohol and sugar actually tend to be really problematic for people who have a primary mood disorder. That's also free for you to work on that. Anyway, what I was trying to say is that for people who are depressed and who want to get well and then who stay well over time, they're actually doing a whole combination of things. And I'm actually pretty famous for saying that ketamine is never more than 10% of the treatment plan. That means that my team can provide ketamine to you, but 90% of the stuff you have to do also in order to stay well. It's not just about the ketamine.
And also it's addictive, which is kind of different than other.
It's not though.
It's not. Was that
Well, okay, anything can be addictive, not just small molecules. Gambling, sex, there's carrot addictions described in the literature.
You said carrot?
Yes.
Carrot.
Yeah.
Seriously. Knew something.
Anything that's reinforcing to an individual can cause addiction, which is like a problematic relationship with that substance or material or behavior, in the sense that it interferes with their life. And then there's like a DSM diagnostic of how they define addiction. It's very different from dependence, which is a physical dependency on the drug, where typically you'll have, you need it to feel some sense of normality, and if it's removed, you'll have a withdrawal syndrome. And even most drugs have some withdrawal syndrome, even caffeine and nicotine, and some are much milder, and some are much stronger than others. Opioids, GABAergics, and alcohol is a GABAergic, have severe withdrawal syndromes. So the degree of dependency can vary. As far as addiction, yeah, there are reports of ketamine addiction in the literature. It's pretty rare. Cannabis, I probably, if I just had to off the top of my head, say, it's probably a similar kind of risk of addiction as cannabis. Maybe benzos and I don't even know though. They might be a little worse, yeah. But it's so, again, I hate to say, because anything can be addictive. So it's never, I always get asked that, is this drug addictive? And it can be. Depends on the individual and various factors in their environment. So yes, but I think ketamine's very low risk for addiction.
I would add to that I don't, in what I've seen, I don't think that ketamine is particularly physiologically addictive. It's just not dopaminergic enough, as Jason said.
Was that you're saying dependence? Or?
Well, I'm talking about it. Well, what I was going to say is that it is, of course, possible to become psychologically addicted to ketamine. I don't think the medicine pulls for that. It is, of course, possible, but we haven't seen a lot of addiction yet in therapeutic ketamine administration, and we do follow people carefully. Most of the people are in psychotherapy in an extended way. I was going to say something else about this, though, ketamine addiction. Oh, yeah. It appears that a key to not becoming addicted to ketamine, physically or psychologically, has to do with having the interval be long enough in between exposures. And we're not exactly sure because it hasn't been fully studied yet, but I'm going to take a wild flying guess that it's around 3 weeks in between ketamine sessions or ketamine exposures. If you were waiting 3 weeks in between each ketamine administration, you don't seem to become tolerant. You don't seem to need an increasing dose to get the same beneficial effect, and we don't seem to be seeing addiction. When people start putting ketamine exposures closer together, recreationally or therapeutically, then we start seeing tolerance phenomenon and other concerning stuff. So that's what I know about this.
And I think it's important to think about the history of ketamine, because it was largely defined by two people who did become pretty seriously addicted to it. And I would agree that the addiction potential is far lower than something like amphetamine or morphine, but that in and of itself can be a little bit insidious, because you see it all the time with cannabis. Many people are quick to tout cannabis as 100% non-addictive, and by many definitions it is, but there are also people that use it every waking moment of their life, and actually quite a few people that do that, and it's probably not ideal for everyone. And I think part of that stems from people's reluctance to acknowledge that there can be problematic use and dependence, and that you have to regulate your use. So in the 1970s, when there was very little knowledge of non-medical use of ketamine or ketamine addiction, there were two people, John Lilly and Marsha Moore, who were not really aware of the possibility that ketamine could be addictive. They both began using it very frequently. They both entered a pretty seriously psychotic state as a result of their continuous high-dose use of ketamine. This is not something that happens to everyone. This is not, something that resembles the way that ketamine is typically used as an antidepressant now. They were using it every day and at very high doses. But in the case of Marsha Moore, she died, not as a result of a direct pharmacological effect of the ketamine, but actually the exact nature of her death is a little bit mysterious, but it seems to have played a role in her going out into the woods in the wintertime and freezing to death. And with John Lilly, he continued using ketamine for his entire life until he died. His death was not associated with the use of ketamine, but he did have a pretty serious bicycle accident that actually was after he'd been cut off from ketamine and started using PCP, and that's what resulted in the bicycle accident. But he also almost drowned to death, drowned a number of times. So
Dialoguing with dolphins or something?
yeah, he was also doing some pioneering dolphin research.
That brings up a good point. Just to kind of tag on to what Hamilton just said, which is that a lot of the risk and problem stuff that occurs with respect to ketamine, as I understand it, outside of a medical environment, is accidents, poor judgment, or injury. Mixing ketamine and alcohol is a totally terrible idea. That can be physically dangerous, not to mention impairment in judgment. But anyway, accidents, and then the whole Marshall Moore thing.
Behavioral toxicity is the #1 cause of death.
And the same is true of PCP as well. With PCP, people regarded it as a very dangerous drug, but it was behavioral toxicity. Most of the people that died drowned.
Oh, but can we talk about PCP for a moment?
Actually, I do want to talk about the other. You guys gave me a laundry list of interestingly spelled drugs to mention while we're here. You did want to mention though. You wanted to go through ketamine harm reduction before we.
I think we've kind of worked it in.
All right.
I've tried to work it
Do
in.
you guys feel adequately knowledged about ketamine harm reduction and ready to transition to PCP? Apparently, there is a variant of PCP called 3-MeO and 4-MeO, something or the other. Are you guys familiar with? Jason, you brought this up yesterday. First of all, yeah. What you want to give anyone want to give a little history of PCP, or?
Hamilton sort of touched
Yeah.
on it.
Okay.
I would say that, so interestingly, PCP is Schedule 2 by the DEA, not Schedule 1. And I think it's underutilized and underappreciated. People are afraid of it, it has a bad rap, and so we have not been looking at it enough as a potential therapeutic agent in a contained environment. What's problematic about it is that it's really long lasting, and so that's sort of undesirable, but it's a particularly beautiful medicine that may have some therapeutic properties. PCP was looked at in the 1970s as a potential psychiatric tool. So yeah, I mean, I would love, in the future, I'd love to see more research into the other cousins of ketamine to see which of these may be helpful for people with mental health issues.
And it's worth mentioning for younger people, I mean, this is before I was born as well, but the magnitude of the PCP hysteria in the mid to late 1970s was equivalent to our fear of opioids today. It was the #1 drug epidemic. There were movies made trying to scare people away from using PCP. Every major magazine ran anti-PCP articles. It was considered the most terrifying drug by law enforcement because of its reputation of giving users superhuman strength. It was even instrumental in law enforcement beginning to use non-lethal incapacitating agents because of a number of incidents where PCP users were fatally shot unnecessarily because law enforcement didn't know how to deal with them. So everyone was totally terrified of PCP, and the legacy of that continues to this day. I mean, a lot of people, if they smoke cannabis and they have a negative experience, they'll say it's because there was PCP in the cannabis that they smoked. I don't think that's typically the case, but that just goes to show that it's almost synonymous with badness.
But do you think that was overstated, or what's your assessment, Hamilton?
I think there's a combination of issues. One is dose. Dose is something that people typically don't pay a lot of attention to with non-medical use of drugs. And you really, with something as powerful as PCP, you don't want to be using unmeasured doses of it because the behavioral toxicity can be enormous. I mean, there's endless scare stories. You could go on and on. There's people that tore out their own eyes. There's people that ate their friends. One of whom is my pen pal. There's
Pen pal in prison?
yeah.
Was your pen pal or your friend?
He continues to be my pen pal. Currently he's my pen pal. But yeah, you could just go on and on about the scare stories, and the truth is somewhere in the middle. There were really unfortunate things that happened surrounding PCP, as there are with alcohol and many other drugs. It would be unfair to blame PCP for those incidents because they were happening in an environment where there was no education other than fear-oriented, prohibitionist messages that made people either use it recklessly or not use it at all.
No DVDs.
Yeah, no CD-ROM.
Well, this is the thing, ketamine and PCP and methoxetamine and dextromethorphan and deschloroketamine and desoxyketamine, which are all the ones that I can remember and name. What they have in common is that they're incredibly powerful tools, and as such, they need to be respected. You have to use them gently. You have to use them with tremendous preparation and knowledge. And they have the potential to do a lot of good for people. They can also really hurt you. And so, just...
And I'll say there's something with harm reduction. Ketamine is a very nice harm reduction tool built into it, in that at high doses it causes complete ataxia and motor, paralysis, essentially. So you get whacked out, but you're not going anywhere. PCP has some ataxia, but it doesn't have that effect. And same thing with some of the research chemical dissociatives. You can black out and get up and move around. And, just like blacking out on alcohol or benzos, bad things obviously can happen if somebody's not watching you and looking out for you. So, that's a really nice feature with ketamine, and one reason why you really don't see any of these, I think, horror stories and things that happen with ketamine, because it's just, if you're at that level, that K-hole, you are just on the floor, that's it. Whereas PCP, you might get naked and be running around and
start eating your friends.
Can we end, actually, Jason, can you tell us about some of the other dissociatives that are in development?
Sure, so there's a large number of research chemical dissociatives that have been made available. The first was a compound 4-methoxy PCP. Since then, a number of PCP derivatives have been sold. They're typically, I guess sometimes they're referred to as legal highs. They're sold often on the internet or in head shops in various countries. And they're just, again, sort of they're marketed as not for human consumption to get around various local laws, but they're derivatives of known psychoactive drugs. So many PCP derivatives have been made available in that capacity and are widely used. Various ones become scheduled in different countries, and so what happens is that then the manufacturers will produce a new compound and sell that. So we now have, I don't know off the top of my head, but 15, 16, or probably more 20 or 25 now at this point, dissociative research chemicals that have been made available or are continuing to be available. The other class, so we have the PCP aryl cyclohexylamines, then we also have the beta-keto aryl cyclohexylamines, which are represented by ketamine. So those are things like deschloroketamine, methoxetamine, fluorodeschloroketamine, FDCK, 2-oxo-PCE. A large number of these have been made available, and they share a structural feature that ketamine has, which is an oxygen in the 2 position. And then finally, there are the what are called 1,2-diaryl ethylamines, represented by diphenidine, ephenidine, 2-methoxyphenidine. These, again, come out of bans, particularly in the UK, to control PCP and ketamine compounds specifically. So actually within a week of that ban going into effect, the websites were already selling diphenidine as a replacement. Just the futility of a lot of these prohibition strategies. And diphenidine has some similar, it's an NMDA receptor antagonist. Pharmacologically, it's very similar to PCP type compounds and other dissociatives, but it's sort of structurally in between PCP and MK-801, which is another very potent dissociative drug. So
What was that last one?
MK-801. MK-801 sort of used as like the gold
That's based on
standard.
MK1 or something? The
It's a
name?
Merck compound.
MK8.
801.
MK801.
And that's not a research chemical. That's sort of like if you're doing research with NMDA receptor antagonists in the lab, you're almost certainly using MK-801 as like a just selective controlled NMDA receptor antagonist. It would be your positive control, like your known NMDA receptor antagonist. It's used, tens of thousands of studies at least. So Yeah, and that's a very, very, very potent compound. It's not quite the highest affinity known. There's a few derivatives that have slightly higher affinity, meaning how potent it is at binding to the NMDA receptor, but it's up there.
Okay, actually, I want to ask Hamilton a quick experiential report. So as you said, PCP has like a bad rap, and not many people hear positive accounts of it. But have you taken it? Is it possible to give us your most positive account of it possible? Just for people who hear positive things about ketamine, but we never really hear a positive account of like PCP. If you'd like to.
He actually has a whole episode on his show about this.
Okay, never mind. But if you have like a little short.
Well, again, I mean, just to emphasize the dose, there's nothing extraordinary about it necessarily. If you take 5 milligrams of the hydrochloride salt, I don't know that it's that different from 3-methoxy-PCP or any of these other derivatives that have been sold on the gray market. This is, I think what is most remarkable about it is that it isn't all that remarkable, despite its fearsome reputation. There's nothing about PCP that's all that strange, and there even was a very brief clinical history of PCP in psychotherapy, and certainly during that period, you don't see anything bizarre happening. Well, slightly bizarre, but nothing cannibalistic.
But is it similar, in experience to ketamine, would you say?
Longer lasting, not as anesthetic, you could say, at lower doses. Again, this is all dose dependent, so it's hard to make these sorts of generalizations. But yes, vaguely similar.
And I've gotten emails from people using PCP even in the 70s to treat depression.
Right. And they're all actually pretty similar from what I understand. PCP, methoxetamine, ketamine.
If not experientially, right?
Experientially, the people report that they're all in the same ballpark.
Pretty close.
There's no outlier, kind of like zombie poison level or something.
The one thing that
Most people probably
even
couldn't
MK
tell the difference.
Even if you tried the MK.
the one thing that we're trying to do here, I gotta get in here,
Yeah.
is we're looking. From my perspective, we're looking at other medicines that might be helpful to people for various clinical applications, and then we're also trying to find something that does something like what ketamine does that doesn't cause cystitis. So cystitis is irritation of the bladder caused by too much ketamine exposure. And it turns out that this is going to be a big problem. And so we're trying to figure out, are there other NMDA receptor
Big
antagonists?
problem in the legal use of it? Because that's actually a problem they have a lot of, I've heard, I think there's a study.
An issue with illicit use as well as medical is turning out more and more. It's unclear exactly the extent, but it's definitely a concern. Even in the recent Janssen trials, there was no cystitis, but there were reports of dysuria and frequent urination. It all resolved, but it's something to closely monitor and be aware of, and they're going to put it in the product insert. It's enough.
That's what I've heard is the most panic media around ketamine is people having to get their bladders removed or replaced or something like that.
It's definitely been shown to be frequency and dose dependent, but there may also be individuals who have various genetic predispositions that make them more susceptible to the effects.
Well, I actually have a hypothesis about this, totally unproven, but I'll just share with you what I think. I actually think that the antihistamine and anticholinergic and drying effects of other oral psychiatric medications might make people more susceptible to cystitis when they get therapeutic ketamine in a medically supervised way. I actually think there may be an interaction between conventional medicine and ketamine, but we'll see.
It's certainly possible.
Are there any other interactions?
Oh, we're going to do questions very shortly, but yeah, totally can ask that. I just had, you mentioned an interesting study in Asia that said young people like K because it gets you very high and it's a fast round trip. Do you want to talk about that
I
one?
think I might have sent you that note.
Oh yeah, that actually, you wrote this email to me. Do you want to talk about that? Is that study pertinent here, or do you want to?
I think I sent you that comment because we were having an email exchange, and that was under the heading of addiction or problematic ketamine use. And there was a study that demonstrated, or that interviewed people with addiction issues with ketamine in Asia, young people, and they reported that what they liked about it is that it was a big experience that was short in duration, and that they could take it after school and still make it home in time for dinner. That wasn't meant as a plug for ketamine. That was just an example of problematic.
Really quick.
That's really all I have to say about that.
Okay. I think I'm want to open up soon. Is there anything else you guys wanted to say or point out before we do that? Great. We have 20 seconds for questions. There are mics over there, but we could probably hear you. So, who is the guy who just asked that? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there's any other interactions between conventional antidepressants and whether patients that you're treating with continue with their normal meds, or if there's any modifications in that.
Yes, there are some interactions. That's beyond the scope of this conversation to get into the details of that. I will try my best to put up a slide on my website about it. But just to say that ketamine plays pretty well with most SSRI and SNRI medications. And so one of the advantages of this particular tool, therapeutically, is that patients can stay on their antidepressant regimen and also get ketamine treatment at the same time. It doesn't play well with a couple of things. Benzodiazepines are a potent ketamine mitigator. Benzodiazepines are an anti-anxiety medication, and used for sleep as well. So if patients are taking a lot of benzos, there's a very good chance that ketamine treatment won't work. Alcohol is a very potent mitigator of ketamine. So if you're drinking alcohol even close to ketamine treatment, 72 hours before, 72 hours after, you're just flushing your money down the toilet, in my opinion. Kava, which is also it's kind of like a natural benzo, that doesn't play well with ketamine. Lamictal doesn't play well with ketamine. That's a medication that has some glutamate modulating properties. Opioids are a mitigator. Barbiturates are a mitigator. The only thing that's actually dangerous with ketamine is alcohol. Ketamine and alcohol should never be used together for danger reasons and also because it's a mitigator. Everything else is not actually physically dangerous, but problematic. Again, I'll put a list for you on a more detailed list on my website.
And I will say, I mean, yes, there's literature with a lot of that. Unfortunately, a lot of it's like case studies and anecdotal reports, which I think are valuable, but I really hope that there's more controlled studies as we go forward that can kind of address that, or careful monitoring, at least with Spravato.
And in some cases,
Spravato.
it's considered desirable. So what you often see with anesthetic use of ketamine is that it's combined with propofol, and the specific purpose there is to mitigate the psychedelic activity, to sedate the patient so that they're less susceptible to having these bizarre psychiatric side effects.
Benzos as well.
Well, right, so just to clarify, people, to tag onto that, patients who are getting ketamine as part of their anesthesia regimen at the dentist or having a surgery, they are not having intense psychedelic experience. They're being given benzodiazepines or propofol or something else specifically to mitigate the visionary properties of ketamine while getting the anesthetic benefit. So I just want to be clear that the surgical patients are not tripping out.
Or at least not complaining about it.
I didn't catch if you guys got background to what the difference of S-ketamine is from regular ketamine, and is it just so they can patent it?
Yes, it's filtered.
Well, okay, so
Sorry, so
yeah. Okay, so ketamine.
The cost would be to the end patient. We had a lot of chatter about it, but does anyone have any idea what it would actually
Talk.
cost in insurance?
We don't know yet. It's
Okay.
it's not even available yet as a product. It's
So what? Okay. So ketamine, when people use that term, they're actually referring to a mixture of two different chemicals, and the reason is that certain molecules have something called chirality. It just refers to how they're oriented in space, and molecules that have one chiral center, like ketamine, can exist in two forms. And the everyday example given are hands. So you have a right and left hand. Molecules can have right and left-handedness. So the right-handed ketamine is R-ketamine. The left-handed ketamine is S-ketamine. And so there's been a lot of work figuring out the different, because obviously they're oriented differently in space, although they have the same molecular formula and they're both ketamine, but they look different, and biological molecules are chiral as well, so they interact with receptors to different extents. S-ketamine has the more potent dissociative effects. It also has the more potent NMDA receptor blocking effects than R-ketamine. So I think that was the justification for Janssen to patent it as a treatment, as a treatment for treatment-resistant depression. And I think it as far as whether there's theories that R-ketamine might also be an antidepressant. I doubt it contributes much to the antidepressant effects of racemic ketamine. The reason being, if you look at S-ketamine and compare it with racemic ketamine, although there's no side-by-side comparisons, for the most part, the response rates are comparable between S and racemic. The rapid onset's the same. The duration of the clinical benefit's the same. The only difference is S-ketamine's about twice as potent when you control for route and all that. So it seems really likely that that's just because when you take racemic ketamine to get the antidepressant effect, you need that much S-ketamine. Now, maybe that'll change, and there are a lot of interest, and millions of dollars are being spent now looking at R-ketamine, so we'll see. But I just, the evidence to me is not very supportive. There's animal studies, but they don't mean much. So, does that, I guess, touch on the difference between the two? Or?
The cheap one that's in every ambulance, that's R?
No,
it's racemic.
Racemic. It's a 50-50 mixture of R and S.
And that's not patented, but one or the other is?
Yeah, S-ketamine was patented for treatment-resistant depression by Janssen. I'm not entirely sure that they may have been able to patent, and I'd have to really look at the patent law to say they may have even been able to patent racemic ketamine for treatment-resistant depression, because S-ketamine, they patented it for a specific indication. It had been around, it had been approved as a general anesthetic in Europe, so it is not a new drug by any means in and of itself. R-ketamine would have been the more novel thing to actually patent. But again, I don't think it would have worked.
Someone has a patent on that.
No, people do now, yeah.
But so here's the thing. Everybody and their mother's brother, every pharmaceutical company in this country has been trying for almost a decade to try to create a ketamine derivative that they could patent that would do something similar to what ketamine does for depression, for primary organic depression. And they were unsuccessful, either because their derivatives didn't work or because they were psychotomimetic, that means psychedelic, but having some sort of mental experience that the researchers judged to be undesirable. So to get around this problem, what Johnson & Johnson did is they took the existing mixture of ketamine, called racemic or generic ketamine, and they filtered it. As Jason said, it's a mix of right-handed and left-handed bent molecules. They put a filter in.
A little more complicated.
What do I know? I'm only a talk about your mother's psychologist. They took the right-handed molecules and they threw them out. And what you're left with is a mixture of just left-handed little ketamine molecules floating around in the solution, and they were able to patent that. And they patented the filtration process, and they jacked up the price by $1 gazillion. And that's what all the fuss is about this week, about the S-ketamine approval that happened on Tuesday night. By the way, we planned this event months ago, but it couldn't have been a better time. So here we are.
And one final justification for the S-ketamine is supposedly reduced duration relative to the racemic ketamine, so that if it's being observed by a clinician, that maybe the time required for observation might be reduced slightly.
Oh, give me a freaking break.
Though less overall drug exposure, because if the R-ketamine is not contributing to anything, why have 80 milligrams of that on board? To interact with all sorts of off-target effects, maybe even contribute further to cystitis.
I've personally tried S-ketamine and racemic ketamine, and I can tell you from personal experience that it's like the difference between Chardonnay and Chablis.
Right, but a double-blind study to assess the cystitis effect. I agree. I don't think anyone could tell the difference. There is a shorter duration with S-ketamine.
There's not.
Well, it's not. You might not think it's significant, but if it is measured in a large enough group of people, it's been shown to be statistically significant.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue with you about it, but I will say that I'm not convinced. And
No, I'm
and
not gonna,
there's not a
they're the
clinical
same,
difference. There's not-
you're being, with racemic ketamine, you're being exposed to more drug that might not be
I don't
helpful.
think so.
No, but by definition you are,
But
right? Because,
in
Do we
any
have
case,
more
the-
questions?
The clinical difference is not substantial enough, in my mind, if there is a difference, to justify the massive price increase. That's my opinion.
I literally see only men who want to ask. Oh, sorry.
So Raquel, earlier you were saying that like not all depressions are the same, and that some people will be harmed by using ketamine.
Yeah. That's right.
And also you said that some depressions, some people are better treated by MDMA. So I was wondering who would be harmed and how, and I'm also wondering about the treatment, about the potential for ketamine for treating like trauma as opposed to a more like what was it, a more biochemical depression.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it requires a somewhat long and nuanced answer, which we don't have time for. So just to say that this is just the tip of the iceberg on this conversation, but it is not a great idea to use. We're using ketamine too much because it's the only tool that we have that's available that does something like this. But actually what we really need is access to a variety of tools, including MDMA, psilocybin, and LSD, in addition to all the conventional tools to help people. And for people who have had dissociative trauma, so that they felt like they were coming out of their body at the time of the trauma, you know what I mean? And or for people who had significant trauma very early in their life, they tend to not do so well with ketamine treatments, and some of them find it distressing. So I think MDMA is a superior tool for the treatment of many kinds of trauma. There is an exception to this, and that is that the deeper the relationship is between the therapist, the provider, and the patient, and the more love and trust that exists in that relationship, probably the more leeway you have to try things that are challenging for the patient. But I can tell you right now that I think it's a misrepresentation for anesthesiologists to say that they're going to give you a bag of ketamine outside of the context of a therapeutic relationship, and that's somehow going to be helpful for PTSD. I think that's problematic, and I think we should be careful and thoughtful about this.
Thank you so much.
Time for a couple more. You go ahead.
Have you looked into the synergy between MDMA and ketamine? And
Well, yeah. So MAPS.
specifically, I just like as you're talking about the bladder issues. Like from my experience, it could be a way of like greatly reducing the amount of ketamine needed because they seem to like really.
So, yeah, it's a great idea, and other people have had that idea and have been talking about it. There's some talk of creating a pill combo of MDMA and ketamine together. We can talk later about the possibilities and problems.
Are they like trying to make more raves happen also? What else is on the agenda?
But, you know, we wanted to, yeah. We promised you
New little
interesting talk.
parachutes to crush up your MDMA in.
The problem is that at the moment is that there are too many bureaucratic and political barriers for us to be able to study a combination like that. We're already killing ourselves to be able to study ketamine, and you know, over at MAPS, they're working so hard to try to study the therapeutic indications for MDMA. So I think it's a while off before we'll be able to do combo work, but certainly it's on our radar.
That's a shame because in my experience, the two together are better than either one on their own therapeutically.
Well, so again, I would argue, or I would offer that these very powerful visionary medicines probably work the best and are best suited to being used in some sort of therapeutic holding context, in a safe environment where there's attention to setting and attention to relationship. I think ultimately that's going to give the best result.
Why did you title this God in a Bottle?
I was really looking for a catchy. Actually, Raquel thought of it, and I don't know. She suggested it, and I thought it was.
It's the nickname for ketamine. Is God in a Bottle.
In what context? Never mind. I forgot. Next question.
Hang out with.
Cool. It can give you, and I don't know if you'd ever call it an entheogen, but it can give you like spiritual experiences at high enough doses, as Raquel was mentioning earlier. So I think that made it make sense.
Well, we didn't really get to talk about this very much, but one thing that patients who have received therapeutic ketamine, one experience that they report very commonly is that they believe themselves to be in the presence of God, or that they have an experience of their own divinity, or they have an experience of the sacredness of their life, or a sense of sacred purpose. Sometimes people express it as being embraced or surrounded by divine love or supreme acceptance. So there's slightly different words that people use, but it seems thematically clustered around this idea of divinity. And so how ketamine is doing that, I have absolutely no idea. But well, I'm going to leave it to Jason to figure that out and get back to me. But the fact that so many people have reported this phenomenon is really quite interesting. And that's how it came to have the name God in a Bottle.
Thank you.
Elizabeth?
Hi. Thank you very much for putting this together, Colin. That's fantastic. And your knowledge, everybody's knowledge, is blowing me away. And my question is ketamine helpful for anxiety? For
No.
existential anxiety?
Existential anxiety is different than biological anxiety. So here's what I'll say about this. Sorry, I don't mean to hog the floor, guys. So one thing that you see really commonly, I will do my best to answer your question. One thing that we see really commonly are patients who have depression with prominent anxiety. So those two things often go together. And this is really a puzzle because ketamine treatments, and specifically ketamine infusion, some people, about 50% of the patients that I've seen and that I'm aware of, report that ketamine treatment is helpful, that it's soothing, that it both has an energizing or mood-lifting component and also has some sort of mood-stabilizing component also. So about 50% of patients who have depression with prominent anxiety feel helped by ketamine treatment. But about 50% of people with the same description, it makes them worse. It's agitating. It's too stimulating. And so when we see patients who have prominent anxiety as part of the clinical picture, God, I sound so nerdy, jeez. They have to have some sort of anxiety management plan in place ahead of time that we've agreed on so that they can hold themselves together after the treatment in the event that they become agitated. So that's part of it. And then, so I'm talking about clinical anxiety. You mentioned existential anxiety. Well, so existential anxiety is a whole different, like existential angst, like why are we here? Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so this is...
Yeah, why are we here?
I'm sure I can tell you in 2 minutes or less. So, this is a fascinating question that you're touching on, and this might be a great place to end, which is this question of whether it's legal and whether it's legally defensible and whether it's ethical to use ketamine as an adjunct for psychotherapy for people who don't have an Access 1 disorder. So as it stands now, the only time that you're allowed to give ketamine treatment or use it in therapy is if the patient has a diagnosable disorder with observable functional impairments and the patient has tried and failed multiple attempts at conventional treatments, and that whatever you do as the clinician is what's called up to the standard of the clinical community, meaning that you could have the notes from this case and take it from one provider and show it to another provider, and they would say, yeah, I would have done the same thing. That seems like a reasonable course of action. So back when I started Kriya Institute in 2015, there was no clinical ketamine community. There was no one to show the case to, because there wasn't anyone else who would admit to knowing anything about this. So I'm going to answer your question in a roundabout way, but one of my goals in creating Kriya Institute was to create a clinical community where we could stand up for each other and help each other in the event of a legal challenge. Anyway, we spent the first 5 years of this whole thing, from 2015 to the present, trying to argue that ketamine is effective for treating depression and that it's safe. And now the FDA approval that came this week, in the last week, has solidified that point. So we no longer have to have that conversation. So now the conversation shifts, and the conversation that we're having in the clinical ketamine community is the following, which is we have a medical agent, a medication on our hands that clearly has rapid acting antidepressant effects that we believe to be pretty darn safe when used correctly by highly trained medical personnel. And that happens to be highly hallucinogenic. And so now we're at the point of asking the question, are the visions useful? Are they valuable? Is it a distraction? Is it problematic? Is it adding something to the clinical benefit? How are people making use of this? Should we be trying to dose under this and avoid it? Should we be giving this experience to more people? Should we be giving it to well people? So now, now we're really at that point of asking this question, what is the value of these visions? And is it useful for other things in psychotherapy? And I just want to go on the record of saying that I think the visions are tremendously useful when patients are properly prepared and when they're adequately supported. I think there's a whole lot there that we haven't unpacked yet, and I'm super excited about what's coming as we have more opportunity to research and use this tool.
I'll do one more. Does anyone have one particular for? Yeah.
You said that ketamine is like the only one that you can work with, but what about other legally available dissociatives like DXM, nitrous oxide, Datura, etc.?
Yeah, we should be studying those. And the reason that we're not studying them is that there's a fundamental bias in science and medicine, Western medicine, against psychospiritual experience. And so the researchers and the clinicians to a large degree are asking the wrong questions, or they're failing to show enough interest in these things. But yes, I think PCP, dextromethorphan, GHB, what was the other thing you said? Nitrous, xenon you mentioned.
How about Datura?
I wouldn't call that a dissociative.
Yeah,
What would you call it, Howard?
It's an anticholinergic deliriant.
Right.
Still probably to show rapid acting antidepressant effects in a lot of preclinical research. I'm not sure about clinical, but
Wouldn't you say that's dissociative effects?
that's a delirium.
Delirium?
I mean, the word dissociation is kind of weird because there's a dissociative component to many different pharmacological classes. But when we're talking about dissociatives, we're talking about glutamatergic NMDA antagonists. This is like a specific subset. So nitrous oxide, ketamine, PCP, DXM, memantine, and so on, MK801. And they've tried. I mean, these things have been looked at. They've been looked at quite a bit. I mean, even MK801 has a whole clinical history. They used it as a treatment for ADHD. They used it as a treatment for epilepsy. They've been trying for a while, not in this psychospiritual capacity necessarily, but they've been trying. They've recognized that there is a huge potential here. It's just been difficult, and I think it's going to remain difficult.
I think we're seeing a change, even at Korea. I mean, the years I've been there, the perspective has changed. People who were hardcore thinking the visual phenomenology, psychedelic experience was something to be avoided. We're starting to come around and see that, maybe this does have potential. I think it has to be done in a very careful, cautious way, and which is something you always do an excellent job of emphasizing, and that's going to be the trick. And how do you bring that to like a wider clinical use? That's, I think, going to be a challenge, but I also agree that I think that can be an incredibly useful tool with these materials to further their efficacy and make more sustainable responses.
Yeah, there's a lot that we don't know, and we're like the surfboard at the front of the wave here of all kinds of interesting new information becoming available, and this is a super exciting time to be a clinician, and it's a super exciting time to be alive.
Well, thank you. You guys want to give a round of applause for our speakers? Now for Act 2, capitalism. Thank you all for coming. I had a couple quick announcements. If you haven't been, I highly suggest coming to Trip Tail Tuesdays. It's a very community-focused event in Bushwick at Caffeine Underground. My friend Kevin will be speaking on recovery, addiction, and psychedelics on Tuesday. And on April 26th, we are doing a talk on Dharma-waska, which is the mixture of Buddhism and ayahuasca and how they may or may not interface. So, thank you for coming. I'll give you a talk, and yeah, have a good week. Thank you.
Coming through.